If you have a doctor and you bring this information to them and their response is, well, I don't know what this is, or I don't have time to look into it, find another doctor.
Greetings, future fossils. This is Michael Garfield welcoming you to another episode of the podcast that explores our place in time. One of the things that will be looked upon by the future in this moment as a precipitous shift is the end of various forms of psychoactive prohibition, the cognitive liberty revolution, the undoing of a temporary modern glitch in the human social operating system that forbade us from exploring with our consciousness. And a big, huge piece of this shift is actually not a human rights argument to cognitive liberty, but a growing body of medical research data, including some very compelling genetic and genomic research that are clearing up some long-standing misapprehensions of the nature and activity of various mind-altering substances in the body and how people react to them differently. Yeah, we're moving past an age where we can suggest one universal approach to medicine or nutrition to an age where we have the ability to tailor specific treatments and lifestyles for people based on the huge spectrum of human diversity. One of my favorite people to talk about this stuff with is my friend David Krantz, a personal nutrition and genetics coach based out of Asheville, North Carolina. David was recently in town with me in Austin for the Body Hacking Conference, where he presented on the current state of genetics research with respect to cannabis in particular, and how people with different gene variants respond so very differently to this very ancient plant with a very long-standing and intimate relationship with the human species. Whether you've had a positive, negative, or no experience with cannabis in the past, I think you'll find this episode interesting as an example of the new kinds of scientific inquiry and approaches to personalized medicine based on genetic analysis that we're all moving into right now and will probably profoundly change the lives of the everyday person in the years to come. A kind of a deconstruction of the modern allopathic medical paradigm. So buckle up for this fabulous conversation with David Krantz. But first, I want to take a moment to thank the 55 people who have reviewed Future Fossils podcast on iTunes. It is the single best way to help other people find and enjoy this show. I love reading your reviews. They are colorful, bizarre, and fabulous, and it costs absolutely nothing. So if you haven't already and you have a moment, please roll over to Apple Podcasts and subscribe, rate, and review Future Fossils. It means a lot to me and a lot to all of the people that you're helping to inform and entertain and inspire. Also, a big shout out to this week's new Patreon supporters, Nick Mann, and also Andrew Perrine, who edited his pledge considerably higher this week. Thank you, Andrew, also. Folks, this show takes between 4 and 7 hours an episode to produce. Not to mention all of the time I spend finding and sharing interesting future news and other stuff in the Future Fossils Facebook group. And then, of course, the maintenance, the outreach, the upkeep, paying for podcast syndication, etc. I do it out of love. It's a gift. It's an act of service. It's a tree I'm planting with no expectations that I'll ever get to eat the fruit. But if you find value in this program and you have the means, then you can head on over to patreon.com/Michael Garfield and leave $2, $5 a month. I've started putting up additional unreleased episodes, early releases, private subscriber-only episodes. There's a ton of that material up on there right now. I've started making even more of it available to patrons at the $5 level and up. Even if you're dead broke, you probably have a phone, because everyone does these days, then you can go to Patreon and download a ton of my music and my writing and art and so on there for free. And also, I am always on the hunt for cool new guests. If you have a suggestion or a topic you'd like to hear explored on the show, send me an email, futurefossilspodcast@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. And that's that, folks. Thanks for bearing through the business. Now get comfortable for this great discussion with David Krantz. Awesome, dude. How you doing?
I'm doing well. Am I coming through on your end of things?
Perfectly.
Okay.
You have a rare excellence in your audio setup there, former Moog employee. I appreciate that.
Yeah, I figured it's the least I can do to contribute to the quality of the podcast, besides the things I guess I'm going to say. But
yeah. Well, since the last time we spoke, you've become kind of a rock star, at least according to your boss, who I saw in Austin last week. And he just telling me you're doing some exceedingly interesting genetics research involving cannabis. And I know that you sent me information about the web seminar that you just taught about this topic, but I haven't had a chance to look at it. So, which is good, because otherwise I might come into this with like 200 level questions, and we would lose the opportunity to introduce all of our listeners to the basics about this, how you got into it. And so where would you start us?
Okay, well, first of all, that's great that I have reviews coming from an employer. That's always, I feel like, the measure of of reality. If someone that is, kind of hierarchical superior speaks well of you, so I appreciate that and that feedback. To be clear, none of the research that I'm doing is my research. I'm basically acting as an aggregator here and kind of being a human literature review, and kind of acting as a bridge between the inane science jargon and what most people's ability to understand things is. And with cannabis, I really haven't even dig too far into the epigenetics of it. I've been mostly looking at the nuclear genome and different SNPs in it and how that influences people's response. And then when you add epigenetics on top of that, that makes for, some really interesting stuff. And it's really what I found is, I'm getting a lot of questions that are pertaining to that. And it's kind of my next area that I really want to dig into. A lot of people have been asking me, what would account for the fact that, I used to smoke all the time and then I quit for a year and I came back to it and have this extreme anxiety. And, when you look at the balance of endocannabinoids in the body, it really paints this picture of this homeostatic system that when you inject these exogenous, external chemicals that are very similar to, the ones we have in our body and, kind of mimic them in a way and activate the same receptors, I think it can set us up for some really interesting things where the body kind of rebounds in the opposite direction, and some people can get hypersensitized, and that's really where the epigenetic piece comes in. So I'm really excited to explore that. But just in general, a lot of what I've been looking at is going through the research and looking at the pharmacogenetic studies on cannabis, which they're kind of few and far between just because of the research climate. But there's some really cool studies on, like, say, for example, this enzyme called CYP2C9. It's a liver enzyme that breaks down THC. And there's certain people who have, depending on your variant, up to a 3-fold difference in your ability to break down THC. And what that means for people is some people are way more sensitive, especially to edibles, because it's very present in the GI tract. So, when you smoke it, it doesn't have much time to come into contact with that enzyme before it becomes active. But when you eat it, it really makes a huge difference. So this one particular study, they gave people 15 milligrams of oral THC and stratified them based on their genotype, whether they were a fast or slow metabolizer. And what they found is the people that were slow metabolizers had 3 times the THC on average in their body over, they were looking at a 3-day period. But within that first 2 hours, it was like the levels are just very different. And of course, the subjective reporting about how high those people felt, they're using kind of a drowsiness score. And the people that were slow metabolizers reported, pretty similar, almost exact same 2 to 3 times the amount of drowsiness from THC and longer duration. And what's really interesting to me in the study is that they also, that drowsiness level came down for those people after about 48 hours. And then on the third day, it spiked back up. So because of that, something residual in there, there's a couple other metabolites of THC that impacts, especially the THC-COH metabolite, which is what gets looked for on drug tests in urine tests. So there's a inherent difference in your ability to pass a drug test depending on what variant you are.
I was going to ask that. Yeah, it seems like I definitely, I remember even before I started smoking, I had a friend who told me way back in the day that he just couldn't do it because he found that it would keep him in a fog for days afterwards. And in this dawn age of pre-genetic literacy, I saw that and I was like, this guy is like a special class of person who's just more aware of his body than my other friends are. And, later on, when I did not feel that fog for 3 days afterwards, I thought that maybe I was just dumb. I'm just always in a fog. I don't realize, but it's funny. I don't want to zoom out too far too soon, but it is funny how this research seems to shed light on personal variation in these, all of these microscopic ways that would seem to liberate us from judgments of ourselves, judgments of other people that we've made that, based on a faulty assumption of our chemical similarity.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's spot on. And I think that's really kind of what lies at the crux of this. And one of the reasons why I find it so fascinating. I can remember when I was 15 pressuring my girlfriend at the time to smoke weed with me and her telling me I just don't like the way it feels, and me just, not understanding that.
I don't believe you.
I didn't believe them. And I was the kid that wanted everyone to smoke weed with me because it worked so well for me. And now looking, at this research and understanding it, from an individual genetic perspective, I'm like, oh crap, I was totally not, they were right. They knew their bodies way better than I did, of course. But, you get into, and to be clear, it's like that one genetic variation has that effect, but when there's so many things that affect it, and it kind of does it a disservice to isolate it. And, you can stack all these other things on top of that. But yeah, it really gives credibility to the idea that you can really only know your own experience, and having compassion for what other people feel in the way that they respond to things, especially things like psychoactives, where it's such a personal experience. It kind of opens up this whole new world of understanding it. Just to give you another example, there's a gene called COMT. That's a very, very well studied gene because it breaks down dopamine. So it's very, important for everything that dopamine does, which is a lot of things. And with cannabis, what they found is that with one variant, it heavily affects short-term memory related to cannabis. So there's one variant that is affected very little in the short-term memory tests. I think there's an 11% drop versus a 40% drop in efficiency on what they call the two-back test, where you're shown a series of pictures or symbols and you have to remember which one you were shown 2 times ago. Some people, depending on their COMT variant, are going to lose their keys all the time when they smoke weed versus, someone where it doesn't really affect them. So then there's a whole bunch of other little things like that when you kind of piece them together, you get this feeling of oh yeah, there's definitely some people that probably shouldn't smoke weed.
Interesting. Because, I think about this. I had Carrie Welch on the show, who's a philosopher of time, and she was talking about the neurochemistry of time perception and how it has a lot to do with the amount of dopamine in the brain. And that, the variance in dopamine release over the lifespan of a human being changes. And so when people report that time is speeding up as we get older, that's correlated with a decrease in the dopamine levels. And she was saying that this is related to ADHD. And then also, I forget the disorder in the film, The Awakenings, where people were just, catatonic and unresponsive. And it turned out that they were actually conscious, but that they had such low dopamine levels in their brain that they were not experiencing the passage of time at all.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, I think I kept trying to remember. I might be getting this backwards, but it's like they may have had too much or something, because it was like the ADHD thing is a dopamine imbalance, so that time feels like it's crawling to those people. And so I think about that with the COMT variant, and how like some people they completely lose their sense of time when they're smoking weed, and other people don't. And those are the people who don't lose their keys, apparently, So
yeah. And there's a few other studies that kind of look at similar stuff. And I want to come back to that notion about perception of time. It was actually interesting you bring that up, because I was thinking about that this morning with myself, and just obviously the show is about, our role in time. And I was thinking about, well, what allows people to expand their perception beyond, because I was listening to your interview with Daniel Schmachtenberger a couple days ago, and you brought up in that conversation, what are the things that are going to allow people to have more agency over their ability to see these longer time spans? And let me come back to that. Yeah. But just in terms of people's perception and the time dilation things that happen with cannabis, there's another study that looks at this gene called ATK1, and they were studying, essentially, you got to kind of interpret the science jargon on it, but what they refer to as psychotomimetic effects of cannabis, where mimicking psychosis. But what that really says is, more psychedelic, more time distortion things happening, visuals, that kind of thing. And there's a variation in that particular gene where one variant experiences less of those factors and the other variant experiences more, pretty significantly, statistically significantly. And that gene in particular is also very interesting, because they found that it heavily, heavily influences people's likelihood to exacerbate schizophrenic symptoms with cannabis, like 12 times risk with this one variant. Yeah, it's pretty strong. But the weird thing is that people with that quote-unquote risk variant, if they don't smoke weed, they have almost a zero chance of developing, I think they're looking at all psychotic diagnoses. So what that's saying is like there's so there's really something in the endocannabinoid system that's being either thrown off balance by inputting these systems. And what this research, why I find it so valuable and why I'm so interested in it, is it expands the conversation to say, how can we be more responsible, especially in the climate of, legalization, and looking at it from a medical perspective. Like, they're incorporating this type of genetic testing into SSRIs now when they're prescribing it for people, at least, the people that are conscious of this and are aware that you can do this, is that some of these genetic tests can predict whether you're going to have a psychotic reaction to SSRIs versus whether it's going to make you feel less, make you feel happy. So, like, I think we got to start treating cannabis the same way, because if you're, a medical professional and you're thinking about giving, a prescription for cannabis for someone with PTSD, it's really worth looking at that particular gene, because it really does help people with PTSD. But I imagine there's also a small percentage of people with that genetic variant that it could throw way off kilter. So kind of looking at this from the perspective of, let's be real, not everyone's going to respond to the same way. Not everyone likes it. The people that do like it love it because it's doing something for them innately on a biological level. Let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater, but let's also not, let it turn into dogma of, if everyone smoked. And this is very reflective of my own kind of personal journey through this, which it's gone from, if everyone smoked weed, the world would be a better place, to looking at this research like cannabis works really, really well for some people, but there are certainly people that shouldn't probably ingest it, just like everything here. So I think it just adds another dimension to understanding how this works. And man, I've got so many tangents to go down here.
Well, let's pick one. Just as an interruption here, I think it's interesting that it seems like over the last 100 years with cannabis, we've gone from it being, I think at one point, the second most prescribed medicine in the United States, at like the end of the 19th century, to it being completely off the table to now we're up the spiral and we're seeing, okay, again, like this is a thing that has medical value, but there is, I think, some value in that medical contextualization of it. And you and I both have firsthand experience of people being completely disrespectful with the very idea of medicine. Like when I was living in Colorado in 2011 and cannabis had just gone medically legal and everyone was trumping up these health symptoms so that they could get a prescription card. And it's just like, oh, I need my medicine, wink, wink. And it's like, that's not very helpful. You know? But I mean,
Yeah, no, 100%. And I think there's something totally okay with saying, hey, I just like the way it makes me feel. And, and the other thing, looking at it, not to be a downer about it, the other thing that this research really shows is that for the people that are attracted to it naturally and have this like, hey, this works great, levels me out, whatever, there's a real biological reason for that too. And you can look at it as medicinal in that way. And it's just, yeah.
Well, it's like the same thing as cheese, right? Like cheese is basically heroin. Mm-hmm. And we just sort of regard it as a food. And so, I mean, we could go down that particular rabbit hole of like the food medicine taxonomy and what a bunch of nonsense it is. But I'm happy to follow you down one of yours if you'd rather.
Just to give you my perspective on that. And that's really, what I do in general is I work mostly with nutrition and that kind of thing for people with these genetic variants. And there's a gene called ApoE that's been a pretty hot topic in everything lately because it heavily influences Alzheimer's. And about 25% of the population has the ApoE4 variant. And about 60% of people with the ApoE4 variant get Alzheimer's. But why don't 40% of those people? And so within the context of having ApoE4, eating a high saturated fat diet 7x's your risk of Alzheimer's disease. Physical activity doubles it again. So are we going to ban saturated fat because it, is going to give 25% of the population Alzheimer's? No, I think we just do the testing and let people understand that, hey, this is a lifestyle factor. This is a risk for you. You can make these choices to mitigate the risk. Just like if you have the ATK1 variant for cannabis, maybe you don't smoke weed, if you don't want to throw off your neurochemistry in a way that's going to be detrimental for the rest of your life.
But isn't 23andMe still like $100? Like, I mean, this world, this like post-prohibition world where, we've adopted a more sensible approach to medicine and nutrition, doesn't that require a sort of democratization of genes testing and like the ability of the common person to know themselves in that way?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. And it's coming. And that $100 price is down from $1,000, 8 years ago. So we're going to see it get cheaper and cheaper. And on an availability perspective, I think it's definitely a lot more feasible for most people to do, especially when you kind of look at it as like, well, that's your information. You're going to have that for the rest of your life, But yes. And that's actually a phrase that I picked out from that interview with Daniel Schmachtenberger was the democratization of healthcare. I really love that particular phrasing that you used because I think that's the future here. And I kind of see, what I've been doing. I mean, I don't have any formal training in medicine. I'm a coach, I do it in a way that, it's non-medical. It's all lifestyle nutrition based, but I feel very qualified to help the people that I'm helping, and having the red tape of you either have to be a medical professional or you can't talk about this stuff at all doesn't make sense for where we're going, because I can listen to, 2,000 hours of podcasts like I did when I was working at Moog and feel like, hey, I've really upped my understanding of some things. And I've acted as this information repository. Maybe that could help other people besides, myself. And when you look at it from that perspective and of course you got to have regulation somewhere along the line. I shouldn't be performing surgery on anyone, and I'm certainly not trying to do that.
But you haven't listened to 2,000 hours of surgical podcasts followed by 2,000 hours of surgical residency.
Yes, right? That's true.
So, I mean, there should be a way to certify people without accreditation, but that's probably a different issue. So I'm curious to hear more about the cannabis genetic stuff specifically. And let's just use this as an opportunity for you to disclose your distillation of that research.
Okay, great. Yeah, let's do that. So I kind of want to back up a little bit and just give people more of a firm foundation to understand what I'm talking about when I talk about these genetic variants. Mostly what I'm referring to are studies on SNPs. And SNPs that stands for single nucleotide polymorphisms. And these are essentially, one-letter switches in people's DNA in a particular place in a gene. And since 2003, we mapped the human genome. What became very clear was, well, most of our DNA is exactly the same, and there's this 1% that's different. And we can, find these particular places in the DNA where it differs on a fairly regular basis. These aren't mutations because they're stabilized in the population. And, I think the cutoff is 1%. If it's less than 1% of the population, it's a true mutation. And if it's beyond that, it's a SNP. And so what these studies are looking at, they're either genome-wide association studies or candidate gene studies, where they're choosing a specific gene and seeing if that variation in that one place is causing a difference in, say, the way you metabolize something or a trait. And then the genome-wide association studies is kind of more choosing the trait to begin with, and then just analyzing all the genes and seeing if there's any differences where they can find that has statistical significance. So when you isolate these SNPs and kind of figure out what they do, you can reverse engineer sort of metabolic pathways in the body by saying, oh yeah, you're likely to break down more dopamine here, but this dopamine receptor is less sensitive here, and the way that this transporter works, well, you're probably not moving dopamine to the receptor. And so you get this picture and you build up the system. And it really ties in nicely to what you were talking about with Daniel, with systems theory, actually. And you can really tie it to these larger structures of how all these little things affect each other, right? And with these cannabis studies, most of them are involved in genes that either break down THC or CBD, have to do with dopamine reward centers in the brain, which there's some really cool studies on that, and other things that have to do with neurochemistry, those genes. And, let me just kind of pull up my notes from the presentation. So I have a little bit more. So, I started this presentation off. I did a webinar on this the other day, and I started this off just reading some sentences from some abstracts from 4 different studies that did not use genetics and came up with 4 completely different results. And just as an example, very heavy use of marijuana is associated with persistent decrements in neurocognitive performance even after 28 days of abstinence. So that was the conclusion from one study. And then on the flip side of that, you have more frequent cannabis use was associated with better performance in attention and working memory tasks.
Son of a bitch. This is why we need you, David.
Yeah. Well, this is why I think this approach is so important, is because, whenever a study that supports someone's bias comes out, that reinforces that bias. So if you're anti-cannabis, when the first study results I mentioned come out, you're like, yeah, cannabis is bad, don't do it, stay away from it, bad for everyone. And then vice versa, when something positive comes out, it kind of gets touted blindly in a lot of ways by the pro legalization folks, which I am certainly one of those people. But I think taking a more measured approach is actually the way to having a real conversation with people on the other side of the aisle, rather than just saying my results are right, your results are wrong. When you add the genetic dimension in, it makes those studies make complete sense why they might have gotten those different results.
Yeah, to zoom out and do a little philosophy of science here, this reminds me of a study I read about where they were doing research on plant germination and growth, and they didn't want light to affect the outcome of the experiment, so they ran the whole thing underground. And then they ran it again later and got completely different results. And it was because they didn't understand that there were tidal influences operating on these plants gravitationally, even without exposure to sun and moonlight. And so, there's so much to say about experimental design and how what we exclude from the framing of the experiment corrupts our interpretation of the results of the experiment, and when you talk about talking to the people across the aisle, I think about the origin of that phrase, and it's like, well, those are your in-laws, you're at the aisle is a wedding aisle, and like ultimately the task of each of us, I think, is to remember that we're playing on a larger team now than the team that we're used to, and that, it does require cultural interoperability if we're going to actually make sense of any of this shit.
Yeah, no, I think that's really excellent. And, I try to be increasingly self-aware of the way that I feel about people that disagree with me. Because I try, but it makes sense to really put yourself in someone's shoes in this context. If they maybe tried weed once and they had some of the variants that might lead to a negative response, you can see why they might assume that, hey, this is what it feels like for everyone. This sucks. Like this makes me so anxious and makes me feel like I just want to eat 30 hamburgers and cry, or whatever it is, whatever their weird response was. It's like having empathy for that response leads you to really understand why there's so much, diversion and thinking around cannabis. And, again, these studies kind of just help nullify that personal opinion in favor of a larger globalized perspective of, hey, we can have all these factors. And another thing to point out here is that all of these studies that I'm looking at are mostly being done from an addiction standpoint, mostly being done from a problematic behavior standpoint. So there aren't even any genetic studies on CBD and all of the medical benefits of that yet. Like this is the very early stages of this. And when, studies come out that point to, better immune system functioning and a relief of PTSD symptoms and that kind of thing, because they're positive results for cannabis, it really begs the question, well, let's get more specific, because we've done it with so many of these other substances. Like to just take caffeine, for example. I mean, caffeine is probably the most researched compound on the planet. There's, thousands and thousands of studies on it. But there was a study that was done in 2006 looking at actually a very similar genetic variant, another cytochrome P450 gene, another liver enzyme that breaks down caffeine. And what they found is that there you have a group of people that are fast caffeine metabolizers, there's a group of people that are slow caffeine metabolizers. And for the fast metabolizers, drinking more than one cup of coffee per day is actually slightly protective against heart attacks, slightly protective against hypertension, high blood pressure as well.
Please God, let that be me.
Yeah. But for the slow metabolizer group, after you drink more than 1 cup per day, you kind of increase your risk in proportion to the amount of coffee you drink. So 4 cups of coffee a day about 4x's your risk of a heart attack for these folks. And that's me. I switched to decaf after I learned this.
See, that's the practical everyday thing, because I feel like this podcast gets pretty out of hand on a regular basis with the big ideas. And it doesn't, I'm really trying to lately, and, having you back on the show to talk about this really specifically, trying to make this about the practical realities of what it is to be alive at this time and how we can apply this knowledge, because it's having the knowledge is not enough. It's got to be applied. It's got to become wisdom, right? Mm-hmm. And if we want to create a culture of wisdom, then, so I'm curious, in studying this stuff, like clearly you've had your own genome examined and clearly you're coaching yourself in some way with all of this stuff. So I'm curious, on a day-to-day basis, how does this knowledge actually inform your decisions? What does the feedback loop look like for you in your everyday life? Like,
Yeah, a lot of it is, taking this knowledge and making sure that it works correctly for me, because it's one thing to find something in a study and it's another thing to live it and try it. And that's part of the reason why, like my boss that you met, Dan, he kind of trained me in a lot of this methodology, and it came as the result of him working with about 2,000 clients over time and picking genes from studies that matched up actually with the lab results and the things these people were reporting, and then kind of throwing out the ones that either just didn't really work in real life. Maybe the significance, the statistical significance they reported in the study is just too small or doesn't really apply. But to answer your question, it does create this positive feedback loop when you give your body the things you want, that it wants. And I kind of see this knowledge as a bit of a shortcut. I'm sure you've had the experience of standing in the Whole Foods supplement aisle and being just completely overwhelmed by the impossibility of narrowing down what might be the thing that could help you do whatever you're trying to do with your health and body.
Speaking of PTSD, right? Like, how do I know what's good for me? Yeah.
Yeah. And then you have, and so, in the kind of health guru culture, you kind of have when someone finds something that works really well for them, they sound the trumpets and say, hey, this is the way that it works. Everyone needs to eat a high-fat diet because it worked so well for me. I'm just going to use like Dave Asprey as an example.
Yeah.
And his work actually really positively affected me because I happen to be genetically someone that high-fat does work well for. But what's very, very clear is that there are certain people that should not be eating that way. But because he had such a positive result with it, he wanted to spread that message with a lot of vigor. And so it kind of gets lost. The potential for the downsides for some people gets lost with that type of enthusiasm. So you have, I don't know what the number is, how many diet books get published per year, but it's some insane number, thousands and thousands of diet books, each one with their own version of what people should eat. And it's absurd. There's no such thing as the perfect human diet, but this information allows people to find the perfect diet for them, outside of these sort of generalizations. And, for me, I have cut down my caffeine intake based on that one gene. I've learned why chaga mushrooms make me feel so good. Are you familiar with chaga?
Yeah, but I'm not familiar with the chemical mechanics of it, so indulge me, please.
Yeah, so the first time I ever tried chaga, I felt like I was high. Like I just got this amazing burst of bliss. I just felt amazing. Like I wanted to go run around and do all the things, and my wife, Roberta, drank the same chaga and was like, yeah, this is fine. Whatever. It's good, I guess. But, she totally didn't have the same result. And maybe a year or so later, after I looked at both of our genetics together. So to back up, one of the big things in chaga is a molecule called superoxide dismutase, which is an antioxidant that your body produces to kind of clean up the mess that your mitochondria makes when it produces energy. Because mitochondria is constantly producing oxidants, which serve a signaling role in some ways. But when they get out of hand, that's where you get the cellular damage from. And the superoxide dismutase kind of deactivates some of those harmful compounds you create as this natural byproduct. Now, chaga has super, super high amounts of superoxide dismutase in it, and it's pretty rare to find it in the plant world. I think the other thing that has a lot of it is marine phytoplankton, interestingly enough. But so the first, and I happen to have a gene that I make about 30% less SOD than the other variant of this, which Roberta has. So her levels of SOD were probably higher to begin with. Mine were lower. And so when I tried chaga, I got this energy boost, I really, really felt it. And so there's a number of other little tiny idiosyncratic things like that it's really helped explain why I've responded to certain substances in some ways and given me kind of a guide to try some new things,
Damn, that's fascinating. So you must, I know that this is, you're not a paid advocate, I'm sure, but I'd be curious to know which gene testing services you would recommend to people and how you would advise people to get into this world and start educating themselves and start making these informed decisions.
Yeah, there's a lot of information out there. And I use 23andMe. There's definitely privacy concerns. People often bring up privacy concerns to me. So what I tell them is use a fake name if you want, have it not linked to your name. I've had plenty of clients do that. They don't care. Have it sent to a different address if you're concerned about privacy.
That's because the insurance company might say you have a pre-existing condition or...
Supposedly, I haven't seen any actual evidence of that happening yet, but that is the concern. The other option, if we're going to see more independent options come online, like, for example, my boss, Dan, is actually working with a smaller sequencing company now to get a specific panel of SNPs together that is not going to operate in 23andMe. But I think 23andMe is a pretty good option. They give you the reports, their health reports, but they're pretty limited in what they can say because of the FDA and regulations like that. But the magic of it is that they give you the raw data, so you can go look it up on your own, and that's really where it gets exciting. And there's a lot of resources out there. There's a great website called Self-Hacked. Are you familiar with Self-Hacked?
No.
Oh man, you gotta check it out. I mean, it's run by this guy Joe Cohen, who's just kind of a savant with systems biology, and he, it's like any substance you can think of. There's an article listing that has pulled like all of the PubMed references for it and summarized it. It's great. It's kind of like Examine, but a little bit more with a biohacker kind of tilt to it. But, you can use things like that. There's self-reporting services, but I will say that unless you really want to spend the time to understand what you're looking at, it's way more helpful to work with someone who's already spent the time doing that, because what will happen, a lot of people will get their 23andMe done and they'll look and see that they have, for example, there's a gene called MTHFR that's become very popular because it heavily influences detox ability of heavy metals, and it also heavily influences your ability to synthesize neurotransmitters. It's kind of a central piece in the one carbon metabolism, very basic kind of methylation cycle. And people will see that they have the variant for this gene that shows reduced enzyme efficiency, and you'll see these forums with people just thinking it's the end of the world, like they have to focus on that one gene and do that. And so it can be very easy to kind of take a myopic view when you're kind of looking at the stuff on your own and just thinking, oh my God, I've got all these negative variants. What am I going to do? I've seen anxiety, it really be anxiety provoking for some people. So, take some of what's out there with a grain of salt, I would say. And
there's a genetic variant out there that it would help if you smoked a joint before you looked at your genetics data. Probably.
Yeah, probably. I would say, find a practitioner. More doctors are incorporating this into their understanding. And, if you have a doctor and you bring this information to them and their response is, well, I don't know what this is, or I don't have time to look into it, find another doctor. Because there are plenty of people who are willing to, add this information to their repertoire, and it's really where the future is going. And that's how Dan, my mentor, kind of got into it, is because he had clients coming to him saying, "Hey, I looked this stuff up. What do you think?" And back in, I guess, 2008 when he started doing this, he said, "I have no idea. I'll look into it." And it became kind of his whole platform now, seeing the power of it.
So, since you brought up the future, I have to ask, where do you think the most promising avenues of research and implementation are in this area right now? And maybe specifically in the cannabis research, what do you think this research is going to lead to in terms of cultural, social change in the way that we relate to this stuff, the way that we consume it, the way that we understand it? How do you see this going? Because I'm imagining, it's very easy to imagine just like a new sort of retail class of cannabis strains that are specifically tailored to people with specific genetic types. But yes, there's got to be so much more going on here.
Yeah, well, I think that that's immediately what most people think of, and actually that's like the last slide in this presentation is what's the dream? A genetic test that can match you with your perfect strain. And I think understanding the dynamics of the endocannabinoid system in a way that allows us to not only pick specific cannabis strains, but understand what other substances are out there that we can stack with cannabis or use instead of to affect these pathways in specific ways. Like, for example, green tea extract also activates certain aspects of the cannabinoid, endocannabinoid system. And there's all these other substances that interact with it in more subtle ways that aren't necessarily psychoactive. And I think this type of genetic research is really going to give us a better picture of how we can modulate and use the endocannabinoid system in ways that don't necessarily require cannabis, right? Like, it's like that's the impetus for discovering the system, right? Like, or discover, we didn't know about that we even had a cannabinoid system until the early 90s, and it wouldn't have been discovered had we not known the structure of THC, most likely. So, with that in mind, I think we're going to see a lot of different treatment modalities that utilize this as a piece in it. And, so that's one on the treating specific conditions, understanding how people might be predisposed to have different levels of cannabinoids and receptors and that kind of thing. Like, I'll give you an example. There's a gene called FAAH, and it codes for an enzyme of the same name. And that enzyme breaks down anandamide in the body or in the brain specifically. And anandamide is one of your main endogenous cannabinoids that you produce. When they discovered it, they named it after the Sanskrit word for bliss because it induced these bliss-like effects in the rats that they were studying. But this molecule breaks down anandamide, so people with more FAAH have lower levels of anandamide naturally, and vice versa, where people with less FAAH have more anandamide. And the people that have more anandamide are just in general shown to be less anxious and have a better stress response. But interestingly enough, they have a much lower preference for cannabis use. And there's a study looking at the subjective response to cannabis with these FAAH variants, and people with the AA variant of FAAH that have the higher anandamide, they reported actually being less, like their happiness level went down after smoking as compared to the other variant, which goes up in the opposite direction. Like, you see this graph that's just like these two lines crossing in opposite directions over 60 minutes. And if you conceptualize that where some people that have lower levels of these endogenous cannabinoids, when you add the THC and all the other things in cannabis it kind of balances that out. Whereas people that have enough of it already, it might be overactivating that and causing them to have a negative response. So that's just an example to look at as we get more and more of these studies and research and really I'm a big fan of the citizen science movement. Like, we don't have to wait for these types of studies. Like, if you have your 23andMe done, look up these genes. You can go to my website and watch this webinar I did, and I have all the slides available with all of these gene identification numbers. You can go look all this stuff up yourself and then start to say, hey, does this match up? And as we begin to have these conversations amongst ourselves, it starts to broaden the playing field a bit in terms of how we can move forward with this thing, because I've got plenty of ideas for cool studies I'd like to see, especially interestingly enough, I have not dug into this research as thoroughly as I'd like to yet, but the influence of time dynamics on the endocannabinoid system. So how do, our receptors and endocannabinoids shift over a day, over a year, or lifetime, those kind of things. And as we begin to look and get a better picture of that, maybe we'll come up with ideas on what is the optimal dosing frequency for people, in terms of where their endocannabinoid system is from the beginning, what happens when you add something in, what happens when you don't, and wait a certain period of time. And as you see these dynamics shift and move over time, like, where does that go? And I think that's really fascinating to me. And then how do you use that in concert with, treating specific conditions for people, and how do you use it in a wellness sense to potentially optimize just people's sense of well-being and health and those types of things? Because what's pretty clear is, like, CBD, just as an example, another isolated cannabinoid, like, has radically changed people's lives. Everything from, seizures to cancer to people reporting just, they feel less anxious and that kind of thing. But again, like, I've also heard people say, CBD doesn't do anything for me. I tried it. I didn't notice a difference. So, how can we better predict those things? And then for the people who, maybe CBD didn't work for them, how do we tell them, well, hey, here's another cannabinoid that based on your genetics might be better for you, and, not let them get to a place where they just write it off altogether because it's lumped into the same category.
So there's a weird tension going on in all of this between, you talking about the future of this in a way that is very much about the isolation and extraction of individual chemical agents and their properties and being able to isolate them from the cannabis plant and that ecosystem of phytochemicals. But then there's also this whole thing about, the need to regard and evaluate all of this stuff within a complex systems context is getting even more and more obviously necessary. And so there's this strange balance that Richard Doyle talks about in Darwin's Pharmacy, where, by extracting something out of its original phytochemical ecosystem, we haven't actually removed the ecosystem. We've just replaced the plant ecosystem with a laboratory equipment ecosystem. And there's like all these tubes and vials and beakers and electrical currents and stuff. And it really, for example, like these various efforts to create prescription cannabis based, like the THC pill and like this kind of stuff, it's kind of Franken, right? Because it's in that space where people are confused about, like, we're still on the cusp of understanding what it really means to balance that tension between the need for increased specificity and the need for an increased attention to the like overhead or orbital view of the whole thing.
Yeah, no, spot on. And let me back up. And I know I kind of went down the road of talking about isolated things, but in general, I'm probably more of a proponent of looking at the whole plant as a system that has its own inherent wisdom in a way. And, the tension there, for me, you can loosen the tension by looking at it almost from an alchemical perspective of saying, well, in order to, to understand what's happening, we have to separate out all these things first. We need to, how can we understand the big picture if we don't even know what all the parts are doing? And I think we're in that phase right now in terms of our understanding where in order to put things back together and see how they all interact, we need to first just see what everything's doing on its own, And I think we're going to see we're going to see those pieces get put back together. I very much hope, just in the same way that, like, well, how can we understand how cannabis affects memory in individual people if we don't look at those individual components and how it's doing it, where obviously that COMT gene is not the only thing that affects it. In this presentation, I talk about 2 or 3 other genes that affect memory as well, including the CNR1 gene, which is the cannabinoid receptor gene itself, receptor 1, that's in mostly the brain. But by looking at all those pieces individually, then you can look at them in a network and really get a better feel for how they're each contributing to that larger picture. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. So you mentioned at the beginning of this call that there was a sort of promising glimmer of bringing these two fields together, bringing the epigenetics coaching and the cannabis genomic stuff, and then also the human gene sequencing and interaction stuff. So, like, on the near term, where do you see the most exciting research and implementation? Like who's got a cool lab? Where's it happening?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I am actually only beginning to get connected with people that are really doing the research, so I don't have a good question for that. But I think just to start where we're at, CBD has kind of become the big star in the cannabinoid realm, and I think looking at studies with genetic variants and how we respond to CBD is going to be a really big up and coming thing here, because it's going to allow people to really make more informed decisions about whether that's going to be something that will help them specifically for whatever they're trying to do, rather than, have the same supplement aisle dilemma of maybe this will help, maybe it won't. I think CBD studies are going to be the most important thing that happens in the near future here for that.
And then also on the issue of legalization, CBD is such a Trojan horse. Like, Texas has been struggling with cannabis legalization, and not with CBD. That's somehow, that's the bow wave of all of this. And, it's interesting, the cultural interpretation, like how, if you want to look at this, maybe this is stretching the metaphor a little thin, but like there's a sort of mimetic receptivity also. It's like certain cultures, that have been smoking hash for thousands of years and it's totally acceptable. And then you've got this other culture that hasn't been smoking for 100 years. And so it's, there's like a cultural endocannabinoid response matrix.
Oh, but, yeah. Well, just to look at it from another perspective in the same way, like that first gene I was talking about, CYP2C9, the one that some people get way too high from edibles because they just don't break down THC as well. That gene is very, very rare in Asian and African populations. So people that are descended from, Asian and African descent, I think it's around 1 or 2% in that population. But if people descend from European population, it's about 15%. So, for whatever evolutionary reason that caused it to, stratify in that way, I'm sure there was some survival advantage that was, given, because it's not just responsible for THC. That also actually influences non-steroidal and anti-inflammatory drugs like ibuprofen. So the people with the slow metabolizer variant also have an increased risk of gastrointestinal bleeding from ibuprofen. And yeah, so like you see, for whatever reason, maybe it is a cultural thing that people are genetically wired to respond differently to it, and that might influence the cultural perception of the plant itself. And then you can tie these things into all these other factors, because there's sometimes you'll see these patterns where one variant of one gene is linked to another one, another variant of this gene called linkage disequilibrium. I'm sure you're aware, but
that has to do, just for listeners, that has to do with, you're talking about the relative distances between genes on the chromosome and the likelihood that they will be like segregated together during meiosis?
More like, say, with this COMT gene, you can either have the GG, AG, or AA variant. And if you're a GG, you're also 90% likely to have this certain other allele type in another place. And so you get these linkages between these different things that can lead to different traits. So just off the top of my head, this is a totally far-fetched theory, but what if people that were inclined personality-wise because of whatever genetic predisposition to seek positions of power in Western society also are genetically predisposed to have poor reactions to cannabis? Because, that certainly seems like the case to me, just based on how, the people that are in power have thought about this, right? And you see this in terms of reinforcement of neurochemistry, and it's like, of course, you can't break everything down to neurochemistry. There's the intrinsic, internal world, that doesn't necessarily correlate, but you see predispositions and tendencies. So could people's poor response to cannabis also link up with other things that might influence them to go out and warn everyone about it? You know what I mean? Like, it's a pretty interesting kind of thing to think about in this downstream network of potential reactions and responses that could influence the entire cultural perception of a plant based on, some influential person's previous experience that's handed down for generations through legend and myth about whatever,
I just had this silly vision of present day David and high school David collaborating on a Joker level project where you put some CRISPR gene drive in the water supply that makes everybody genetically compatible and desirous of cannabis. And so you just like, well, it doesn't work for everyone, but now it does. Genetic terrorism.
It's really funny you bring that up, because as I've been doing this research and, as I was putting together the webinar and everything, I was my 15-year-old self was just laughing so hard that this is what I've made a career out of now. I totally did do my AP bioethics paper on cannabis, and it's been a long-term theme. And I think you'll appreciate this too, Michael. I've been meaning to mention this to you at some point, but so for AP Bio in high school, you have to do the AP test at the end, and that was, I guess, 2006. I was first exposed to the work of Stuart Hameroff and Roger Penrose and the orchestrated objective, their OR theory. And like, it just made, like, I was so mad.
The quantum mechanical model for consciousness in microtubules in the brain for people who don't know.
Yeah, and they were kind of the seminal folks who initially posited that could be a thing. And I remember coming across that and being so pissed that was not a part of my biology class in high school. And so instead of answering the essay questions on the AP Bio final test, I wrote this tirade against the current institution of what I perceived to be the man, like, at that time. And I remember there was this line, I ended it just by saying, something like, the field of biology is at a dead end unless we incorporate the quantum effects into our understanding of how these things work. And looking back on that now, it was me being a dick, me just being like a rebellious kid, who just wanted to like, this isn't the right thing that I'm being taught, like, pretty much how everything else I felt like. But just looking back on that as sort of a precursor to all this stuff, that I'm looking into now, I feel just for whatever reason innately primed to kind of go after this.
Yeah, dude, I can relate to that. I wrote one of the timed essays in my AP English class, a rehearsal for the test. I was on John Donne's poem, Batter My Heart, O Three-Person God. And it was, like, we're looking at, what was that, like 16th century, kind of like proto-romantic, self-flagellation poetry. And we were supposed to write about this. And I wrote my timed response in iambic pentameter, like rhyming couplets. And the teacher sent it to the AP board and asked them what they would have done with this, which, it succeeded in achieving all of the essay writing goals, the argumentative goals of the assignment, but was stylistically like a total show-off prick move. And they said that they would have actually flunked it. They would have disqualified it as a response on the AP exam. So the teacher kept my essay and said, kids, don't do this. Like,
oh, that's hilarious.
Don't fly too high or you'll get slapped down by the AP board. Anyway, really I can respond to that. The rebelliousness is mutual.
Yeah, well, what's funny is I actually got a passing grade on that. Like, whoever read it was like, yeah, okay, fine.
So you've outcompeted Graham Hancock in speaking truth to power.
I don't know about that. He's pretty much just on a permanent quest on that front, I feel like.
Yeah. Well, dude, it's been so good to have you on the show. I think this is really vital and liberating literacy that we're just right on the cusp of, and it's really important. I think the work that you're doing, and I'm excited to see how it unfolds.
Really appreciate you having me on and kind of giving me a platform to talk about this stuff, because I too feel like it's just really critical in expanding the conversation to incorporate a more realistic and scientific viewpoint, and it really kind of cuts through some of the ingrained dogma, no matter again what side of the aisle you sit on. It just gives us more tools in our tool belt to really have a informed conversation, and I'm really happy to be able to do that, and kind of play that part.
So where can people find your work? Like, how can people stay up on your research and possibly even like connect with you about this stuff?
Yeah, so you can go to my website, www.david-krantz.com. All of my articles that I've written on this topic are up there. You can watch an hour-long webinar recording that I did that covers all this stuff in depth, and also gives a bit of background on the genetic side, just to really set the stage for this information. And we didn't talk about any of the other things I do, but I also make music. And by the way, Michael,
great music.
I really appreciate just seeing how you have taken all of these things that you are innately curious about and turned them into this larger just collection of things that Michael Garfield does. And I really want to applaud you for kind of not caring if it necessarily make sense to everyone all the time why you're so interested in all these things, but you're just naturally, curious about it. And I've been thinking about you lately as I'm kind of crafting this platform of all these random things I do and how I can kind of congeal them together.
Well, you have a job, whereas I'm unhireable now. Because of that. People look at that and they're like, what the fuck? So like, you're smart to keep them partitioned, I think, a little bit.
Yeah, but they're becoming less and more partitioned. They're just leaking into each other slowly over time, like some kind of like when you mix wet ink and oil to get the oil paints together, and they just kind of form that nice ooze of whatever it is. I feel more inclined to just let that happen. But anyway, so I make music. You can look me up as Few Texture. I also run a company called Visionary Magnets, which Michael was kind enough to sort of let us be a sponsor earlier in the year when we were doing a Kickstarter. But if you like hilarious magnetic poetry that kind of skewers the new age fluff mentality, you might like that too. If you're a fan of Future Fossils, you'll probably like that too. I'm just gonna.
You'd never know from the Visionary Magnets Instagram feed that the guy behind this project is a visionary geneticist, but it's true. I wanted to tell you, dude, that you gave me a couple extra Visionary Magnets kits to give away, and I gave a kit to Duncan Trussell at Burning Man,
good.
And I gave a kit to Chris Ryan of Tangentially Speaking.
Cool.
And co-author of Sex at Dawn. They both got Visionary Magnets kits, and Duncan immediately opened his, and there was a big metal sheet for some reason in his camp. So he immediately was just like, "Oh, perfect! This will go on our." And they were like playing with them all week at Burning Man.
Oh, so. Perfect! That's great. I might send him a message and see how he's doing. If any of them made him back from Burning Man.
Yeah, I don't know, but. Anyway, yeah, cool, you're a very diverse and talented dude, and I encourage people to check out all of that stuff. Few Texture is awesome music. Visionary Magnets is a like acupuncture relief of the frustration that I experience in festival world, and obviously this genetics research is super important to preventing my next schizoidal freakout. So.
Yeah, well, they all happen from time to time. Thanks for letting me come on and do this. I love the podcast. I love all the guests you've had. I mean, I'm honored to be in the canon of those folks. It's pretty amazing.
Thanks, dude. Have a great day.
Yeah, you too.
Thanks again for listening. I hope you enjoyed that episode as much as I did. Future Fossils is part of the MindPod network, along with Third Eye Drops, the Astral Hustle, Synchronicity Podcast, and an oodle of other fascinating programs. I encourage you to go to mindpodnetwork.com and subscribe to them all. And stay tuned, because we have some awesome episodes coming up on Future Fossils, including special episodes on the mythology and history of science fiction, robot sex, visionary art, non-dual philosophy, science journalism, the future of mobility and housing, the future of work, magic, the future of education, music as a force of healing. The list goes on and on. And many of those episodes will be going up first and unedited for Patreon supporters. So if you want to hear this show the way it's recorded and not the way it's shared, then hop on over to patreon.com/Michael Garfield. Again, thanks for listening, and have a most excellent eon.